Welcome to TYT Interviews, everybody. Ben Mankiewicz here. Great guest this week. I've gotten to know him a little bit over the past few days, over this holiday season. He is the author, among many books, of The Fight for the Four Freedoms. I need to be able to look at the front to be able to read it. What made FDR and the Greatest Generation truly great? He is Harvey Kaye. Professor Harvey Kaye is the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy, Justice Studies, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, also the Director of the Center for History and Social Change at the university. Harvey, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm losing you just a bit. You know, there's a sort of breakup in there, but Ben, I'm ecstatic to be here. I'm a fan of TYT. I subscribe, and I've been looking forward to talking to you.
All right, well, good. So you heard that. So we'll check the audio, make sure the audio works well. So Harvey, first of all, let me start. What I love about you, may I ask? I don't usually start interviews this way. How old a gentleman are you?
39. 67.
What I like about that is that you're a tweeter, and you tweeted. You had a tweet storm yesterday. So I want to talk about this because you have at various times since November 8th been engaged in a bit of bucking up of the troops. Like, hey, there's a solution to this. And the solution is mostly to fight for what we believe in. But I'm going to run through some of these tweets. Read was your first few tweets. Read FDR's Four Freedom speech. We'll obviously talk about that. Read Abe Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Read the Declaration of Independence, the preamble in the First Amendment. Read Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Of course, you also wrote a book on Thomas Paine. What is why do people need to read those texts?
Okay, I want people to read the text because I think that's the entry to our making or creation of a new narrative. I think one of the problems we had this past year, well, for many years, I think it goes back 40 years, in fact, but I thought it was really, I agonized over it this past year. I was really in pain over it. Is that the Democrats, and this ranges from liberals and progressives to radicals, across the political spectrum, not only among the Democrats, but even to their left, they had it wasn't just they had no vision, they had no narrative. There was no sense of history. There was nothing that could transcend or move beyond Make America Great Again, which is, as much as it's filled with nostalgia and whatever kind of racist and sexist ideas stood behind it, at least offered a sense of history. And by the way, it was an echo of Ronald Reagan's campaign of 1980, which also used the slogan, Make America Great Again. Conservatives lay claim to American history, and then they completely mess it up, and they lie about it, they falsify it, they appropriate our heroes. I mean, give you a good example, just as long as you brought up Thomas Paine and reading all these things. You get Ronald Reagan in 1979, and especially in 1980, quoting Thomas Paine, and quoting the most radical renditions of Thomas Paine, as if Paine is somehow a champion of conservative and libertarian values, when in fact he was a radical Democrat in the American Revolution and the French Revolution and working class movements of the North Atlantic. Similarly, you get Newt Gingrich, who, strangely enough, actually has a PhD in history. He writes books about American exceptionalism, which implies that it all stems from the Declaration, which may well be true, but he goes on to talk about American history as if there was no struggle to bring to life any of the ideas of the Declaration. And when you look at the past year, it was true of Hillary Clinton. It was even true of Bernie Sanders. There was really no effort to lay claim to American history and to remind Americans of just how, Lincoln talked about the better angels of our nature. Well, the better angels of our nature is that radical progressive instinct that we sort of carry within us that goes all the way back to the likes of Thomas Paine and the Declaration and the preamble to the Constitution, and similarly expressed in the Gettysburg Address, and I can go all the way through. We need to cultivate that narrative. So I wanted people to read those works as a way of beginning to remember, as a beginning to transcend the amnesia that we suffer as a consequence of 40 years of class war from above that's been not only economic and political, but decidedly ideological.
So, I don't want to suggest that this country understood its history firmly prior to the breakout success of Twitter and Facebook, but it seems like our understanding of complicated historical ideas and just the history itself has been obfuscated by ability to reference history in 140 characters. So when you mentioned Newt Gingrich, and you have a piece coming up soon in Salon, basically about Newt Gingrich's war on the age of Roosevelt. And Gingrich was speaking, I guess, at the Heritage Foundation, and
Right.
he began his speech by saying that the Trump presidency, and Newt, of course, a longtime supporter of Trump during this campaign, that the Trump impending presidency represents the third great effort to break out of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt model. What did Gingrich mean? Not so much just what the first two were, although feel free to share those, but what does that mean? What does he still want to take apart that the last 40 years hasn't already taken apart?
Okay, well, let's remember that Newt Gingrich probably went to the Heritage Foundation to try to convince, or at least, sort of push the conservatives. I don't even like to call them conservatives, the reactionaries that they are, to push them to see Trump as their champion. I mean, conservatives, reactionaries for this past year have kept their distance, in fact, from Donald Trump. The National Review kept its distance. A few of the editors there actually, I know for a fact, didn't even vote for Trump. The neoconservatives at the Weekly Standard, they've distanced themselves almost from the Republican Party, it seems. Crystal just doesn't want to have anything to do with the likes of Donald Trump. So going to Heritage is a way of going to this sort of bastion of conservative / reactionary politics and letting them know that they've got a real opportunity here in Donald Trump to go after all the things they've wanted to go after since Roosevelt first initiated them in the 1930s, and then Lyndon Johnson initiated the Great Society in the 1960s. So, keeping in mind that includes in the 60s Medicare and Medicaid, and probably in light of all the rhetoric of the past year, the Immigration Act of 1965 probably involves demolishing the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and consumer product safety regulations. I mean, and that's just for starters. The National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, public broadcasting, the full array of 60s initiatives that Lyndon Johnson, who was in many ways the political child of Roosevelt, the things he initiated along with all the progressives of that decade. But then if we go back further, and this will show you how powerful a movement these guys are about to wage, Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act, which were 1935 initiatives of the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal administration. So the whole arc of 35 to 65, the arc of FDR and the arc of what we call the greatest generation, is going to be not just under siege as it's been for the last 40 years, it's going to be under assault and direct attack, you can bet. And so in essence, when Gingrich goes to the Heritage Foundation, he's trying to bring together the Republican forces of Paul Ryan in Congress and, the whatever kind of forces are arrayed behind Donald Trump to bring about this new Reagan revolution of 1980, this new Gingrich revolution of 1994, the Trump revolution of 2017.
So one of your tweets, you point out that, well, first of all, a couple of them I want to refer to, but we confront conservatives, we confront not conservatives, but reactionaries, and you referenced it there. So what does that mean? How should we think about that? Like you mentioned the National Review. So let's take Bill Kristol at the Weekly Standard, Jonah Goldberg, the National Review. To you, are those guys still conservatives, or are those reactionaries, or are they different? And where is Paul Ryan fit?
National Review is the sort of flagship of conservatism going back to William F. Buckley in 1955. And the Weekly Standard is essentially the flagship of what has been neoconservatism. And there's an uneasy relationship between those two groups. They've been off and on friends and antagonists. I mean, they represent the two most significant intellectual groupings on the right. But the reason I talked about reactionaries just now, and I talk about it, I think, in the article, is the fact that what we've seen, of course, with the Trump campaign is really the ugliest face of conservatism by way of the alt-right. But even more so, the fact is that for too many years, we've allowed people to throw the term radical around. Once upon a time, not so long ago, and at least within my lifetime in the 50s and 60s, radicals meant progressives. It meant folks who were fighting liberals. It meant people who were further to the left than that, as socialists and radical Democrats. And reactionaries referred to those folks who wanted to throw us back into the 1890s or perhaps the 1920s, the ones who opposed, the ones who wanted states' rights, the ones who really did want to block racial and gender justice and equality, the folks who really did want to smash labor unions. They were reactionaries. And indeed, what we've seen for the past 40 years are, we've been under siege on the left. I don't think anyone would deny that. And we've seen all of these initiatives of the 30s through the 60s being whittled away. In fact, more than that, we've seen even the separation of church and state whittled away. So, and by the way, there are any number of Democrats we call neoliberals who've cooperated in all of that. So when I use reactionaries, I want us to realize that we're not talking about the loyal opposition conservatives, the folks who might have been sort of Eisenhower Republicans. We're talking about folks who really want to take us back to a different age, a sort of pre-20th century kind of situation.
We're talking.
Are you still picking me up okay, by the way?
We are. We lost you for a second there, but we
Okay.
we got the thrust. It was it was good. It came back right for your big finish. This is it's Professor Harvey Kaye from the University of Wisconsin Green Bay. His latest book of many is The Fight for the Four Freedoms: What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. So to get to what is exactly in jeopardy, the gains made and the progress we made in the 1930s and then again in the 60s, everybody knows Roosevelt's, of course, famous speech, I think December 8th, 1941, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But am I correct? Is or no, that was the date that will live in infamy, excuse me. So, but go back to January 6th, 1941, and his Four Freedoms speech and what that is, and then the real progress that I think obviously progressives identify with, but I think some number, I don't know what the percentage is, I'm not an expert, some percentage of Trump voters would resonate with as well. Tell us about that speech and what the Four Freedoms are.
Okay, so first thing to remember, of course, is that by early 1941, fascism ruled the continent of Europe. Britain was under attack by way of the German air raids and the Blitz. The United States was basically the last standing, other than Britain, of the Western liberal democracies. And Roosevelt knew that it was essential to defend Britain, that we had to do something because Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy. But he also knew, and they had all the intelligence that showed them that there was no doubt that Hitler had a plan. He was going to come to the Americas as well. They actually knew the route that he was going to take to attack the United States. They expected some kind of Japanese attack, but Hitler was really on the mind of Roosevelt. And in late December of 1940, after Roosevelt had won the third term victory, he went before the American people in a fireside chat and said that it was really important for the United States to become the arsenal of democracy. And that meant we should rev up our defense industries, not simply to protect ourselves should a war come, or in any case to be so strong that nobody would want to attack us. It was also the case that we were going to supply to Britain, under Lend-Lease arrangements and other things, the kind of wherewithal that they needed to withstand the German assault, the German Blitz. So he then went before the American people, he went to Congress, the American people, in January 6, 1941, to deliver what we know of as a State of the Union address. Then it was called the Annual Address. And he spoke to the American people of how important it was to prepare our defenses. And after this long address, in which he also indicated we should expect no warning when the attack comes, whether it be in the Atlantic or the Pacific, that we should not give up the things that we had been doing during the New Deal. He said, if we're going to fight a war effectively, we need to actually expand upon the New Deal. We needed to fight poverty. We needed to make sure that our civil liberties were respected. And he laid it all out. In fact, he included essentially national health care on his list, on the agenda he wanted to pursue. And he then said that in the future, when the war was over, that we should envision a world characterized by four fundamental freedoms. The first, freedom of speech and expression. The second, freedom of worship. The third, and these were the innovative ones, you might say, from the off the Bill of Rights, freedom from want and freedom from fear. And when he gave that address, and it's notable that columnists and Eleanor Roosevelt observed that Republicans were less than enthusiastic about it. And on freedom from want and freedom from fear, he wasn't so sure the Southern Democrats were all that keen about it, because it seemed to imply that African Americans would enjoy all these things as well. But the American people did hear this, and New York Times and other newspapers said this was the speech that the American people needed to hear to counteract what isolationism prevailed.
Real quick, let me ask you what freedom from want we can figure, but tell me what FDR meant by freedom from fear.
His exact words were actually far less progressive than Americans heard. This is the interesting thing. Freedom from want, he talked about essentially setting up trade relations among countries so that all nations will be in a position to provide for the needs of their citizens. And freedom from fear, he talked about in terms of disarmament, and I think he had in his mind the creation of the United Nations. But when Americans heard these things, they actually heard them in a very progressive sort of New Deal-like way. So freedom from want implied we're going to take the New Deal and we're going to expand upon it. And for many people, that meant including in Social Security, national health care, making sure that every American who wanted a job had a job, those kinds of things. And freedom from fear. Now, that's interesting because it seems that African Americans heard that, and they believed that that meant they would be able to walk freely and not be subject to lynch law, and that, in fact, that the Jim Crow South was basically being warned by FDR that day, the end of Jim Crow might be coming. That's how they heard it. It's also the case that many American Jews heard it in terms of their own security here in the United States. Let's not forget, in 1940 and 1941, there were right-wing Irish Catholic thugs who were egged on by Father Coughlin, this Canadian Catholic priest who came into the United States and set up a remarkable
Father
Rush
Coughlin was Canadian?
radio. Yeah, he was born in Canada, Father Coughlin. Fortunately, imagine if he wanted to run for president. So although as a Catholic priest, I doubt if the Southern evangelicals would have voted for him.
Probably not.
But the key thing is that Jews heard this as saying, we're also going to defend people of many faiths and their right to be who they are and to walk freely. And by the way, Catholics too could have heard that and believed that it actually meant that they're not going to be subject to, right-wing Protestant attacks in Indiana and in the South. I mean, people heard it and they translated it into their own American terms, which is why, although when asked, most Americans couldn't tell you exactly what the four freedoms were. They'll also note that they couldn't tell you what the Bill of Rights actually were either, line by line, but they had they instinctively embraced what Roosevelt said. And then the images came to life, I'll just point out, in 1943, when Norman Rockwell finished his paintings that became major illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post, the Four Freedoms paintings. I kind of wish I had an illustration for you right now. That's the Lincoln-esque figure in the town hall in New England speaking. That's the multicultural, multi-faith picture that he did of people praying. It's the grandmother putting the turkey on the Thanksgiving or Christmas table. That's the one that commerce loved to use for advertising. And last but not least, the freedom from fear, which was very, very much a reflection of the day, was middle-class parents putting their two children to bed, tucking them in safe and sound, and the father holding a newspaper. And if you look closely, the newspaper talked about bombings in Europe, the Blitz and bombings in Europe.
I'm looking at them right now. Yeah, it's easily Googleable to people watching.
Yeah, people should Google them. And I'll just point out that the 75th anniversary of those paintings and the war bond drive of the Four Freedoms is coming up in 2018, and I've been doing some work with the Norman Rockwell Museum in favor of that.
Well,
so anyhow, go ahead.
Well, so let's at one point tonight you discussed that some neoliberal Democrats have a role to play in this too, and so I want to make sure we talk about that, and I want to talk about it in this context. First of all, well, I'm going to ask you a specific question about Barack Obama later, but let's Let's go to November of 2008 and Barack Obama's impressive victory over John McCain. Democrats with wins in both the Senate and retaking the House with solid majorities in both, near 60, I believe, in the Senate. Weren't they at 59, I believe, in the Senate?
Yeah, and I think if you threw in, if you threw in the vice president, it clearly was 60.
That's right.
To break that, you're thinking breaking the filibuster, right?
Yeah, so but dominant majorities in both. And then not much happened, and certainly no FDR-like charge, and no message conveyed about what we were going to do beyond hope, right? No agenda laid out. But also he was up against this, and you write about it in the Four Freedoms, and I'm reminded of it, and we talked about it then. John Meacham in Newsweek, after that win in 2008, urging Obama not to push too far or too fast because America remains a center-right nation. Is that correct? And do you think that sort of manner of thinking, not Meacham in particular, held some sway with the president? What motivated him to not strike, to pass while the iron was hot?
Well, of course, he had the fiscal crisis. You know, the financial crisis, the mortgage crisis is undeniable. Though, as Harry Hopkins said in the 1930s in the New Deal administration, you know, and I think, what's his name? Now Rahm Emanuel repeated it, you know, crisis affords an opportunity. Well, so he had that. But it's also the case that Obama wanted to pass some kind of, or some variation on national health care. But it wasn't very Roosevelt-like to put all your eggs into that one basket, you might say. Roosevelt, you know, his first 100 days involved creating initiatives like the CCC, you know, subjecting banks to new regulations, passing the act which created the Public Works Administration. I mean, the first 100 days for Roosevelt made heads spin. The first 100 days for Obama were important in terms of his push towards stimulus package and saving. You know, well, actually, the banks had already been saved even before he came into office. But what was significant was that he clearly was revving up for this initiative for healthcare. But doing so, he left the American people and the young people, you know, the young people who were so ready to follow through on yes, we can, he left them off to the side. And he basically negotiated his biggest initiative, the healthcare initiative, by talking to two main senators, Snow and the other one I'm forgetting right now. But he was pursuing his healthcare initiative by negotiating. Well, by the way, pursuing his healthcare initiative, we later found out, by negotiating with the pharmaceutical industry and the health insurance industry. You know, when that came out, what we realized was that all bets were off for some kind of serious national health care that might actually involve an expansion of Social Security. So, yeah, no, I mean, Obama may have been portrayed as FDR in magazines and Nation and New Republic, you know, editorials and articles. But it's clearly the case that he backed off the idea of yes, we can. You know, I told my students in the fall, you know, the spring and fall of 2008, that if Obama was serious about yes, we can, the first thing he should do is to create some counterpart to the Civilian Conservation Corps, where he would say every young person graduating high school and college, if they want to spend 2 years in a national internship, the federal government's going to create it, and we're going to create a grassroots effort to redeem the best of America economically, culturally, excuse my using the term, spiritually. And just imagine if all of these young Americans and all their wonderful American diversity went around the country into, you know, these initiatives for education, for healthcare, and other things. I mean, think of the difference that would have made instead of us seeing the mobilization of the Tea Party occupying the public square.
So it was a tactical mistake on Obama's part, you think, for how to proceed in a very un-FDR-like FDR-like decision.
Yeah, unless you want to go the next step and say that Obama had no desire really to mobilize anyone.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. I mean, without getting too far into it, which side? I don't know that someone's intent or their heart matters. On the end, it only matters what you did. But
right.
Where do you think he came down?
Well, where do I think I think he came down. Well, let's put it this way. I think that what we saw was another Clinton administration. You know how Hillary said she was going to be another 4 years of Barack Obama? Well, Barack Obama was the return to Bill Clinton. How's that?
Okay, yeah. So now, interestingly, when you write about FDR, and you mentioned it a few times, you talk about his failures and overreaches and compromises too. So you don't. This isn't a pie in the sky. FDR was perfect and everything he did was great. Where did he make a mistake? Where were the compromises wrong? How does that relate to the political math that any Democrat would face today?
Well, the early mistakes that were made in the early days of the New Deal had to do with the fact that he trusted big business too much at the outset. He trusted big business to cooperate with the ambitions of the New Deal, and it took him not too long to figure out that that big business had very little desire to recognize labor unions, had very little desire to move in terms of raising the wages of their workers. And he discovered that soon enough, and that led to a 1935 second New Deal, which is where the National Labor Relations Act comes in, Social Security is enacted, and the creation of the Works Progress Administration, in which they mobilized, all the more millions of Americans now, instead of just young people into the CCC, people now in their 20s, 30s, or even 40s, who could go out and, build roads, build parks, create parks, help build bridges, build schools, build post offices. So he learned the lesson there. Then in 1936, he won with the largest, majority any president had ever seen. I mean, and he dominated the congressional election of 34 and then again in 36. And he stepped a little too far there because he knew that he had to change the Supreme Court if he was going to make sure that Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act survived. So he started talking about changing the structure of the court. That is, that given the weight of business before the court, every time a justice reached 70, that the president should be able to nominate and appoint, that is, another judge, that we could expand the court to lessen the load for these elderly justices on the Supreme Court. And that was an overreach. And though a lot of Americans actually liked the idea, folks in Congress, including his own supporters, had serious doubts about it. It seemed to be what they called packing the court.
Yeah, and it also has I like it because it was tactically, you shroud what you really want to do, which is get your judges in there, with this idea that we need to lessen the load on the septuagenarians.
But history is always filled with the ironies, right? I mean, if except for the fact that I'm really seriously worried about the Trump administration, I could have a good time with the ironies of history. But the ironies of history in the second term of the Roosevelt administration is that justices started dying, and before long, I guess it's by 1940-41, he's basically appointed a whole Supreme Court of his own, including a new Chief Justice. And it becomes known as the Roosevelt Court. And of course, if we all knew what the future held, if he had known what the future held, he could have sat back and just waited and everything would have turned. Not to mention the fact that in 1936 and 37, there were justices who surprised everyone and actually went with the idea that the Social Security Act and the National Labor Relations Act were indeed constitutional. Well, maybe that's not unlike Roberts falling on, coming down in favor of Obamacare when that came up before the Supreme Court. The difference is, of course, is that Social Security is Social Security, and Obamacare, however wonderful it is for the many millions who are now included and the young people who get to stay on their parents' health insurance plans, it is the case that it was also a gigantic gift to the health insurance and pharmaceutical industries.
Well, you know this better than I. The argument I used to make defending Obamacare, and there's no question that what you say, that your criticism of it is true, that it was a gift to the pharmaceuticals and the insurance industry, but that it's much easier to change something that already exists than to create something new. Is it correct to say that we made major and significant changes to Social Security after its creation?
Oh, absolutely. The original Social Security did not include coverage for agricultural workers or for household workers. Southern Democrats, who were the reactionaries of the day, something about the South, I guess, the reactionaries of the day they couldn't build into the Social Security Act any more than the National Labor Relations Act blatant racism. They couldn't say no blacks will be included inside of Social Security. So they went for the occupations that they knew they were most concerned with: Southern black agricultural workers and Southern household workers. And they excluded those two categories of workers from the bill. Roosevelt was not going to lose Social Security. He figured we'll come back to it and we'll get them included someday. It's also the case that Roosevelt wanted health care included in Social Security, and the American Medical Association, which was always an enemy of national health care, they warned him, forget it, or we're gonna do everything we can to block it as well. Well, anyhow, so Social Security goes through, and later it's expanded, and it's expanded under Truman, and you'll be happy to know, under Republican Eisenhower, which is why conservatives didn't care for Eisenhower very much. So it indeed becomes eventually a fairly universal program. That's the same also for National Labor Relations Act. It took a long time to include those major occupations.
I want to get back to Trump, but since I'm not a historian, I want to ask.
Sorry,
this
I'm getting rather historical here.
Well, it seems to me that history has been kind and will continue to be kind to the administration of Dwight Eisenhower. Is that fair?
You know what? You broke up and I missed the question.
No, that it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but that history has been somewhat kind. Recent history has been kind and will continue to be kind to the administration of Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh yeah, you know what? It's funny. I have to tell you that. I can tell you a few stories on this. I mean, people on the left generally saw Eisenhower as anything but somebody that they would embrace, other than maybe his leadership during World War II. And I can remember reading any number of people about Eisenhower, that he was not an enthusiast for civil rights, that he was not an enthusiast for anything that was particularly progressive. But it's the case, and this we do know, that he knew his own veterans. He knew the greatest generation, and he knew what they wanted. In 1943, when Americans were asked what they wanted after the war, they wanted everything. They wanted national health care. They wanted guaranteed college, basically. They wanted food, clothing, and shelter. They wanted a job for everyone. They wanted social democracy. And he led Americans in Western Europe in World War II. He knew he knew what they wanted. So he told his press secretary, I think it was in 1952, and then in 1954 he wrote a letter to his brother. He had a conservative brother and a liberal brother. He wrote to his conservative brother who was belly aching that Eisenhower wasn't conservative enough. He wrote to his brother and he said, "Hey, look, any party that goes after Social Security, labor law," and he listed all the progressive changes of the Roosevelt years, "any party that goes after those things will never be heard from again in American life after my administration." So he knew. Now, it's an interesting line. We've now liberals have come to see Eisenhower almost as one of their own. If I can just mention, I get a kick out of my friend John Fugelsang on radio. On Sirius, when his idea of an example of somebody who was a champion of these things, he loves to throw Eisenhower at folks who oppose these things. And Eisenhower would not have been the person I would have chosen. I would always go back to FDR, and I would go to LBJ in spite of the war in Vietnam as a champion of these things. But I guess John gets a kick out of citing Eisenhower against Republicans.
Real quick, is it not true that at the end of the war, that in the early 50s, that both parties were soliciting Eisenhower? That it was unclear exactly which party would get him?
Yeah, absolutely. Even Truman imagined that Eisenhower might succeed him. There was no question that they believed that Eisenhower would make a good Democratic candidate. And by the way, he would have made a decent Democratic candidate in 52. I'll tell you, it's a myth that Stevenson was the great liberal candidate. He didn't believe in national health care, he didn't necessarily support the National Labor Relations Act. He had as his running mate Sparkman from the South, who was a segregationist. So Eisenhower might have been better.
You mentioned your significant, this is really maybe the most important thing. So it's like a good interview, or I'm getting to it here at the end of the interview.
This time is flowing, you're good.
You talk about the threat that Trump really poses. In that tweet storm that we opened with, your 9th tweet is that Trump lost the popular vote, but he and the GOP will ignore that and proceed to pillage the nation. So First, tactically, something that Democrats don't ever seem to get, like Dick Cheney claiming a mandate in 2004. These guys don't care. They lost one election, barely won the next one, and thought they had a mandate. Trump loses the popular vote by 2.8 million votes, more than that.
You remember the term political capital?
That's right. So they've just decided they have political capital. Democrats seem unable to use it when they legitimately have it. This is an argument Cenk and I used to have all the time, where I would say, wait, they're waiting, and it turned out Cenk was right. I was 100% wrong. So, but what does that idea, that notion that they are going to, when you say proceed to pillage the nation, you say you're legitimately fearful of the Trump administration. You very reluctantly supported, I won't say reluctantly supported Hillary. Hillary was not your choice in any way, but you recognized a unique danger in Donald Trump that needed to be opposed.
I think reluctantly is probably true.
Okay, all right. So, but you did support her because Donald Trump posed a unique. What is that danger? What is your tangible fears of the things that we could lose or the things that we count on and believe in that could change?
Okay, so in the same way, I could see a shopping list that Paul Ryan has, or or a menu, as we used to say in the old days of the Chinese restaurants, the A and B menu. And I can see him sort of saying, okay, what are we going to go for first? Well, they don't actually want to go after Obamacare first. They might actually go for something bigger. They might go for, say, going after Medicare. They'll try to privatize Medicare. They'll figure out a way to privatize Social Security, a little bit by a little bit. They might indeed want to change immigration laws. In other words, they'll go after the full list of items that progressives secured from the 1930s through the 1960s. They will take up Ronald Reagan's original laundry list of things when he was, speaking for Barry Goldwater in 1964, and later realized that Americans had no desire to vote for anything as reactionary as Barry Goldwater, so he would move a little bit away from that kind of politics when he ran for president in 1980. So I actually fear. Look, we've already seen the effort to suppress the vote. I can see that. I can see the National Labor Relations Law, the National Labor Relations Act, being overturned in favor of, what do they call it, right to work across the country. I can imagine laws regarding gun. If we think the gun control laws have been destroyed already, wait until we see the first year of the NRA running the Trump administration. I mean, here in Wisconsin, but the other thing to consider is this. A lot of things will happen at the state level that have already been happening. They'll happen at a faster pace now that they know that they'll run into no opposition at the federal level. We're
seeing it, obviously, in North Carolina, which called a special session today, the night we're conducting this interview. Everybody thought to repeal the transgendered bathrooms bill, and they got the city of Charlotte to repeal their ordinance first because and then they just didn't do it. To say nothing of the stripping of powers they levied on the Attorney General Cooper, who's coming in as governor. So, but you mentioned right to work, and that one of the questions that I wanted to get to here toward the end is that why on the left do we appear when in the 1930s and 60s we seem to have our finger on the political pulse of the nation and knew how to use it? Why are they, the right, which sort of is joyfully anti-intellectual, with some obvious exceptions, no question, but aggressively anti-intellectual, why are they so much better at it? You mentioned right to work. That's what got me thinking about it. Just 3 words that make Americans think, whoa, who's against right to work? That's a great way to put it. And we have to defend, no, that's not really what it means. So I'm curious how we got trumped, no pun intended. That's the thing we're going to have to say now for the next 8 years. We can't use the word trumped anymore. But how did we get beaten so badly politically when I am convinced that we're theoretically, I don't want to say we're smarter, that's so arrogant, but when they're celebratorily anti-intellectual, but they get politics, it seems, and we do not.
Okay. Can I first double up on your remark and then try to explain it?
Yes, of course.
A good example. So this goes back some point in the mid-2000s, and I've been trying to tell my local state senator, who's a Democrat, who was the deputy, sort of chief of the state Senate Democrats. I said to him, you guys are out of power, basically. I think it's time for you to start developing the narrative, okay? Start coming up with some good language, How about going back to FDR's Economic Bill of Rights, Or how about going to the Four Freedoms? I didn't talk about the Economic Bill of Rights this evening, but that was that 44 speech that he further develops the Four Freedoms in. Why don't we go back and get a good slogan that Americans may not remember it, but it'll resonate in the kind of deep cultural memory. And he said, "Oh, great idea, great idea," and they did nothing. And I remember turning on the TV one evening to a sort of statewide public affairs program where the leading assemblyman or senator from the Republicans was debating in a conversational fashion the leading Democratic leader of the in the state legislature. And the Democrat they were arguing a state health care plan. And the Democrat was laying out beautiful ideas and beautiful policies and, enough to put you to sleep. And all of a sudden, so the woman host turns to the Republican and says, "So what do you think about that?" And the Republican says, and I remember this so clearly, he said, "I think we ought to let the magic of the market do its work." Now, the magic of the market.
Magic of the market.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was like Disney World. Man, it was just magic. So, and I thought to myself, so why is it that Democrats are so incapable? And I think one of the reasons, I could talk about being too smart for our own good, but I think it's something deeper than that. I think the Democratic Party, somewhere in the early 70s, and I talk about this in the book, the Democratic Party really did lose confidence in their fellow Americans. In part, it did come out of a kind of liberal elitism that emerged in the course of the late 60s. And it was also the fact that conservatives were doing such a good job in trying to divide Americans over race in the wake of the urban violence and riots of the late 60s. And I think what happened is that, it's identity politics came to play in the Democratic Party. And identity politics has been important. It's played a significant role in mobilizing forces and pursuing cultural changes and political changes, but it distanced the party from white working people. And by the way, white working people, when polled in they were as radical as anyone in the 1970s. I mean, really, the shame of it is that these smartasses like Gary Hart, and I'll use him as the prime example, turned on the New Deal. Gary Hart ran for, I guess it was Congress or the Senate in Colorado, arguing for the end the New Deal. We're going to be a whole new party. So I think too many of these sort of younger Democrats, Carter was sort of their chief figure. He wasn't young, but it was the case that too many of them just turned their back on working people. And by the way, you turn your back on the white working class, you're turning your back on Black working class, Latino working class. The fact is that when they made that turn, they became the party. Tom Frank does a good job of this in his book, Listen Liberal, where he talks about the Democratic Party becoming the party of not just elites and liberal elitism, becomes the party of the well-educated. And well-educated people talk to each other in just such terms, and fail to be able to talk to their fellow citizens in a way that takes ideas and policies and puts them into terms that Americans don't have time to study, but they can immediately embrace. I don't think working people are any less intelligent than anyone else, but they don't have the time. They're working too many hours to spend reading The Nation and The New Republic and all of that. They want to know, what are you about? What's the vision?
Yeah, right.
Where are we going? Sorry, I'm getting wrapped up.
No, but and if you wanted to object to Hillary Clinton, and we both did in many ways, it was that you knew what she was about. I mean, who knows? We don't know whether she would have been a better fighter than Obama was as president. I think she would have been, but it's a guesswork. It's just a parlor game. It means nothing. But I think but we knew what she was about. Can
I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Here's a question I have.
Okay.
I'm not so sure we actually knew what she was about. I mean, I think we knew what she was about, which didn't necessarily enhance her image to the likes of you and me. But can you tell me the three things that Hillary Clinton stood for?
No, I think I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, sort of for a continuation of a very moderately progressive status quo. Of inching along, of incremental change, but don't rock the boat and don't upset people, and try to bring as many people with careful politics into the tent as possible, and keep the economy strong. And by keeping the economy strong was making Wall Street and big business happy. That was I think what their belief was. I just believed that she might fight because she was a fighter and Obama wasn't, and that the reactionaries in Congress require a fighter and not somebody who keeps reaching their hand out to get it slapped back.
Yeah, Ben, on that, I think I agree with you. There was this thing in me that said, okay, even if she's not the progressive that Bernie is, even if she's not, there is something, she seems undaunted at times. I mean, the fact that she hung in there all of these years, undaunted. The only problem is that she was so close to that Wall Street establishment that some of the things that I really did want to see, I had serious doubts about her pursuing. Another night, don't hesitate, you and I on a private call can talk about the campaign and the disasters of the campaign, how she opened up by challenging everything Bernie said. 15, no, best we can do is 12. All the economists tell me that. Free tuition, no, that's a disastrous idea. Then all of a sudden, she's doing it later. She's like embracing Bernie's stuff. Well, why do we assume that people didn't already hear her and decide that's what she was about?
Totally, and especially when you already aren't trusted, and the theory is you'll say anything. All you're doing is reinforcing a perception that we already had. It was illogical. A couple more questions before we go.
I'm in no rush.
First, I just want to tell you one quick story, because you mentioned sort of that change in the Democratic Party. Certainly a reaction to the sobering loss of the campaign that my father and Gary Hart ran in 1972 of George McGovern.
Sorry, I did notice I didn't mention your father.
My dad would not have been would not have signed on to any argument that we should undo the New Deal in any way. That was not. I'd like to talk.
I'd like to talk to you about that stuff sometime if you have good memories of it, because I can never figure out what motivated Gary Hart.
Gary Hart, Gary Hart, I think usually the smartest guy in the room, but it's tough when you start to believe that you're the smartest guy in the room. Like you shouldn't. But anyway, my dad in 1976, in the summer, it had to be the summer, so I think before the convention, after Jimmy Carter had sewed up the nomination in 1976, my dad, who'd ran McGovern's campaign in 72 and obviously worked as Bobby Kennedy's press secretary in 68, left where we were over the summer to go to Plains to spend a long weekend with Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter, excuse me. And he went down to Plains and Carter tried to hire him to run the campaign in 76. And my father said no, because he just thought this is not the successor to Robert Kennedy and George McGovern. It isn't. And ultimately, my dad always said that it came down to one question that he asked toward the end, which is this. He said, Governor, you're going to get asked this question a lot. I want to know how you'd answer it. Why are you running for president? Right, the basic question asked of all candidates. And Carter told him that I want to make government work more efficiently. And my dad thought, nope, wrong answer. And that was that. And Jimmy Carter, of course, has been such a powerfully important, in many ways, progressive figure since leaving office. But
I'm going to make a lot of enemies, but I don't want to go. I don't want to talk about Carter in those terms. I see him as having been a disaster for the Democratic Party, and he's not redeemable in those terms to me politically.
That's okay. That's right, because the repercussions of the damage done is not outweighed by what you do once you've lost. But anyway, I knew you'd like that my dad. That's why my dad turned him down. Make government work more efficiently.
Sometime again on a private call, we don't need to go off on these things. I have things I really do want to ask you about that. So.
Okay, well, last question then. So you mentioned, it was almost like you're hesitant to do it because we don't want to be the people sort of stoking the flames of racial animus in the country. But there is some segment of white working people who are persuadable, no question, and can be part of some larger movement. It doesn't strike me as impossible that you can still be aware of and utilize identity politics when necessary, which is, again, a term that now we're using that is probably we ought to do away with. But nonetheless, that identity politics can be part of the movement, and that we can also deliver a powerful economic message that appeals to working Americans of any race, many of which will be white. I don't see why there isn't, at the end of the rainbow, a candidate who can do that. But before that, a movement, a whole slew of Democrats who talk that way. And they don't just talk that way. They talk that way because those are the policies they want to implement. I know you don't disagree, but answer, please.
I don't at all. I don't at all disagree. my frustration right now is that how do we find, how do we look? I believe in popular politics, but I'm no fool. How do we find the one or two or three figures who can truly bring this Democratic Party together, can with liberals and progressives and others people on the left to start laying out the resistance to what is coming? And I don't know who that is. I mean, Keith Ellison is, may get the DNC chairmanship, but that's not the place where a lot of this happens. That's where grassroots activity happens. We need someone like Bernie or someone else who's really going to. And my understanding is he still hasn't become a full member of the Democratic Party. I think that's a mistake. I mean, if you're going to champion something, then just pay your dues and
right.
do it.
I agree.
It strikes me that really the time now is to start rallying, not for 2020 or anything like that. Bernie won't be running in 2020, but we really do need some figure, and he's the guy. But I will say that he continues to worry me, that he just doesn't seem to figure out that America has a great social democratic tradition, that working people know that the American working class is in fact very diverse, and we don't have to have the old debate of white working class and people of color. The working class is American. Back in the 30s, Roosevelt had to face up to that Southern Democratic opposition every time we went with a bill to Congress. We have to face up to the fact that we have had 40 years of class war, and it's about time that Democrats recognized it and mobilized to fight it. Now, it's coming, okay, and they're going to pass these laws. And the trick is that we have to start mobilizing the narrative, the vision, and a set of policies and initiatives so that we don't hear the magic of the market and our heads, get all lightheaded, we get lightheaded. We have to start talking about, common sense. And, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And all men and women are created equal. And that America is about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that requires at least a $15 minimum wage. Let's talk in American terms about making American history.
Well, that is a great place to stop. So I'm going to ask you one more question, because that's why I screw things up. In really 40 seconds or less, because you mentioned, first of all, wonderful that you point out, many on the left, I think, missing in their anger at what they saw in the emails from the DNC, misunderstanding what the DNC was capable of doing, what it does in general. But it still would be nice to have a progressive lead the DNC. It would send an important, powerful message, and it could influence policy and grassroots organization. If he weren't now seen as an establishment pick, I would have liked Tom Perez. And you know more about Tom Perez, I suspect, than I do, Secretary of Labor under Obama. It strikes me, Keith Ellison, Tom Perez, I was like, oh, well, that's not the worst choice that the Democrats are ever going to have. Am I wrong?
Right. The only danger we had with Tom Perez is that he did endorse the TPP.
Well, he was the Secretary of Labor, but I hear you. But
right.
Yes, he did.
Right.
No question.
But he did endorse it. And as a consequence, that's the kind of thing that in the short term could have been used against him. Oh, you can just imagine the Trump people saying, hey, the new leader of the Democratic National Committee is going to be a guy who supported TPP. We're not going to let that happen to you, so. Yeah,
okay, well, and that's it. But he's not a monster, right? He's not a neoliberal.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, God, no.
Yeah, all right.
No, absolutely not.
All right, Professor Harvey Kaye, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, the Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies, also the Director of the Center for History and Social Change at the university. His book, Harvey's book, is wonderful, an important read. The Fight for the Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation, truly great. Professor Kaye, we're going to talk again. I appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure, not just to talk, but to see you.
Ah, fantastic. It is a great pleasure to see me. You are correct. All right, Professor Kaye, thank you so much.